always believed that Joseph Smith was just Joseph and Emma, that they were the dream team. They were, that Joseph loved Emma so dearly. It's always been so easy to find paintings. Faithful Mormon painters often paint pictures of Joseph and Emma together in a loving embrace. You know, when they did the film for Joseph, Joseph's bringing Emma flowers, but you will not find a faithful Mormon painter depicting Joseph Smith with his 30+ wives. Of Joseph Smith's many secret marriages, 7 of those wives were under 18 when he married them in secret, and 11 of those women were already married to other men. And keep in mind that the other reason given for polygamy is to multiply and replenish the earth so there can be more Mormons, more saints on the planet. A lot of the women he married were already married to other men, and those men were living. And so Joseph Smith, there's one case that Lindsay will talk about today where he sends one of his faithful men, one of the men who believes he's a prophet of God, he sends him on a mission. While he's on a mission, Joseph Smith tries to convince his wife to marry him. So that's one of the stories of many that we're going to talk about today. Today's video will feature my guest Lindsay Hansen Park, and I know her from her podcast, Year of Polygamy, where she talks about polygamy in Mormon history and about how this doctrine impacts the lives of members, specifically women. I love this conversation with Lindsay just because it is so crazy to talk frankly about the doctrine of polygamy and how we were both raised with this idea that polygamy will exist in the afterlife, this idea of having to explain polygamy in the history of the church, and we both discuss what it was like to leave the church and learn more about the history, and she is such an expert. I'm very excited for you all to hear from her today. It also, as I was editing and preparing the video, reminded me of when people would ask me on my Mormon mission what Mormons believed about polygamy, because believe it or not, that's a fairly common question for a Mormon missionary to get. And of course, the answer that I would give, which is the same answer that was given to me, is that the Mormons were involved in a war at the beginning of the inception of the religion. This was called the Mexican-American War, and what I was taught is that so many men died during the Mexican-American War that there were all these women left with kids but no husbands. And so to basically protect these women in this very vulnerable state, you know, I would say women couldn't have land back then. All of the women were collected and given to men in multiple marriages so that they would have a provider, they would have a landowner, the children would have a father, the mother would have an income. I was taught that the reason for Mormon polygamy was basically because the women needed to be taken care of, and this was the only way after all of these men died during this war. A quick Google search will reveal that only 20 members of this Mormon battalion during this war passed away. That's a pretty small percentage of the size of the church at that point. And this is completely inaccurate as to the reason why Mormons practice polygamy. Historians also agree that polygamy began around 1835 or 1836, and the Mormon battalion happened in March 1848. So 10 years later. A final crazy story for you all before we jump into the interview. A few years ago, when I was in labor in the hospital with my first son, my husband got a call from our bank, and the bank told him that all of the money had been withdrawn from our checking accounts. This was literally the worst time for something like this to happen. Being blindsided by something like this is one of the most helpless feelings, and it's a perfect example of why it's so important to protect yourself online. This is why I'm so grateful for Aura, the sponsor of today's video. They are my one-stop shop for protection online. They provide so many tools to keep what happened to my bank account from ever happening again. Aura offers identity protection, transaction monitoring, which saves me so much stress, 3 bureau credit monitoring, and credit locking. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. We spent hours on the phone with our bank trying to figure out this mess, which is why I'm so grateful for ARA's advanced security measures, which keep me from feeling vulnerable online. What's worse is that our data is being exposed by companies that we're supposed to be able to trust. I just got an email the other day that Ticketmaster had a data breach. The data of a staggering 560 million users was put up for sale on the dark web. And Ticketmaster doesn't even seem to be doing anything about it. These data breach emails used to cause me so much stress, which is why I'm grateful that ARA has finally given me peace of mind. I'm not going to leave my family vulnerable to these data breaches, and if you don't want to either, you can go to ara.com/Alyssa Grenfell. You can also find this link in the description below to try your first 2 weeks free. Let's jump into the interview with the wonderful Lindsay Hansen Park.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Hansen Park. I'm excited to be talking to you today. I have started a podcast called Year of Polygamy that covers the history of Mormon women and the history of Mormon polygamy from the beginning until now. And that podcast was started in 2014 and kind of exploded my life into the world of modern Mormon polygamy. So I have some unique and sometimes exclusive access to some of the most isolated fundamentalist groups in the American West. And I have spent a lot of time interacting with and engaging the history and the complexity of this topic with current polygamists who still trace their belief systems back to Joseph Smith, which we're going to talk about today. That led me into a lot of other things. I just finished an academic biography on Juanita Brooks, a Mormon historian, that is coming out with the University of Utah Press next year. And I do a lot of film consulting work. I was the Mormon consultant on Under the Banner of Heaven. I just finished a show called American Primeval. It's coming out on Netflix. I've done many true crime documentaries about Mormonism. That's kind of our genre. We always joke that Mormonism is a true crime genre. It's not a funny joke, but it's kind of a true joke. And I'm the executive director of a Mormon open forum called Sunstone, the Sunstone Education Foundation, where we sort of gather the best experts on every subject matter in Mormonism and bring them together every year. We have a conference. This year it's August 1st through the 3rd at the University of Utah.
I'm presenting on Saturday evening, so if you are curious to come hear me speak, there's so many amazing presenters who are on the roster, so check out, I'll put in the show notes and the links below, how you can join Sunstone, how you can come watch me speak, and all the other amazing speakers. So Sunstone, I've never spoken at Sunstone, but I've heard about it and listened to a lot of different speeches from Sunstone for years at this point.
Yeah, it's really cool. It's been around for 40 years, almost 50 years, actually. I got to update it. It's 50, we're going to hit our 50th year next year. And yeah, it's a really cool group of people, very open-minded. We have very fundamentalist polygamists that come, and then we have atheists and ex-Mormons, and it's one of the only spaces I know of where all those people can come together and just turn off, the arguments and sort of engage in really cool discussions.
So Joseph Smith, I always understood that his polygamy started with Fanny Alger.
I gotta say right out the gate, this is a contested history, and it's contested because the stakes are really high. So when you're in a community like Mormonism, where people are basing their lives off of the way that we understand history, we have very fraught debates. So that is a complicated way of saying we actually are going to do our best at getting the most accurate numbers, but this was a very secretive practice, especially in Joseph Smith's time. And we have a lot of later reminiscences, people sort of remembering the history after they had lived polygamy for, decades. And so I'm going to give you the best dates that we know. There is an idea that Joseph Smith was thinking about polygamy as early as 1829. And we know that because in the Book of Mormon, when he is translating, writing, however you want to see that, the book, there's a book of scripture. The chapter is called Jacob. And in Jacob, Joseph Smith outlines basically that polygamy is not of God unless God commands it for certain reasons. And so we know that Joseph Smith, it's on his mind. Now that would make sense because prior to that, just 2 years before, he had married Emma Smith, and within the first year of their marriage, there are allegations that he is, aggressively pursuing her best friend. There are rumors of affairs early on in their marriage, and so clearly Joseph Smith was contending with that idea. The next sort of benchmark for Joseph Smith's polygamy is 1831, where Joseph Smith is said to, and of course W.W. Phelps, this is a later reminiscence, like 30 years later, but W.W. Phelps, who was a scribe of Joseph Smith, claims that Joseph Smith taught a group of men that they were to take on Lamanite women, indigenous Indian women, as concubines, as plural wives. So that's known as the Lamanite Revelation, or the Lamanite marriage revelation of 1831. We don't have anything extant in Joseph Smith's hand, but we know that he's considering the idea of men doing that. And the thinking, of course, the whole premise of the Book of Mormon is that white people are called to convert and colonize Native Americans or indigenous people, anyone that's brown, basically, from Pacific America to South America to Central America to, wherever indigeneity resides. And so the idea is, if white men married brown women, they could slowly turn them white through their seed, their lineage. Of course, it didn't apply to indigenous men. They weren't allowed to marry white women, so it didn't go the other way around. As far as we know, no one took him up on that offer. But then, we have some early 1830s, 1840s examples of Mormon men going on missions sent by Joseph Smith to, like, the Cherokee Nation, where they do take indigenous wives. We go up to 1835, and this is the date that's contested, anywhere from 1835 to 1836, some place at 34, some places as late as 1838. I'm going to say 1835. This is where Joseph Smith is now settled in a town called Kirtland, Ohio. And in Kirtland, it was basically a congregation that belonged to Sidney Rigdon's following, called the Family. They were living as sort of a commune, like hippies. They were sharing everything. And when they were introduced to Mormonism, Sidney Rigdon brings a whole congregation to Joseph Smith. They settle in Kirtland. And so they're kind of in a communal mindset as it is. And Joseph Smith takes a young girl, Fanny Alger. And you said Alger. I used to say Alger too, but I've had a descendant correct me very, very sternly that it's Alger. Fanny Alger lived in the house with Joseph and Emma, and this would become a pattern for Joseph Smith to find, groom, prey on, however you want to revelate his plural wives. But it was also a common 19th century practice that families who had a lot of children, they had the boys help with the hard labor, and if they had lots of daughters, they would, sort of farm them out to other homes to help with domestic work, because the domestic work was very laborious too for women. So Fanny Alger became a maid in the Smith household in Kirtland, Ohio. And she was said to be around 16 at the time, 16, 17. Again, her age is a little bit debated. You can check out Don Bradley's work. He's the expert on Fanny Alger. He even contends salaciously that Joseph Smith and Fanny Alger engaged in an affair where she is impregnated by Joseph Smith. So there's some debate about that as well. But we do know that a relationship formed. And I say a relationship because I don't know what consent was like in that household. He clearly had a position of power. She was a much younger girl. He was in his 20s at the time. Was in a relationship with him. Emma discovered it. There are differing accounts, later reminiscences of how that happened. Allegedly, the most common one is that she walked into the barn, found them celestializing, or, the transaction occurred is one of the reminiscences words. And Emma got upset and kicked her out. And she is quickly, her and her family, who were early converts to the church, leave Kirtland sort of in the scandal. It was a scandal so much that, Joseph Smith's contemporaries called it a dirty, nasty, filthy affair. Apologists have tried to change those words to mean like it could just have, affair didn't mean affair. It meant something else. But that's what we know. And we know that she got quickly married to Solomon Custer and had a baby shortly thereafter. And that's why there's some questions on the paternity. And then she goes on to have children with Solomon, and they leave Mormonism. So that's really the first example. Now, I believe, and I think the evidence supports that most people would have seen that as an affair. Joseph Smith had a reputation. It was kind of the worst kept secret about Joseph Smith, is that he had a penchant for women. I mean, remember before this in 1832, he's tarred and feathered, allegedly for potentially, being with one of the Johnson daughters who was really young at the time. Whether that happened or not, it does show that there were rumors about Joseph Smith.
Learning more of the story about his relationship and courting Emma, how much he went behind Emma's father's back, how they got married in secret, how when they go and see Emma's father again, he cries and says, like, you've stolen her from me, essentially. And even that, which everybody loves Emma Smith now, at least I was taught to love her and revere her. Even that, it shows like the beginning to me of this pattern of doing whatever he wants and kind of going behind people's back to get with the woman that he's after.
Yeah, I mean, and we can trace back the sketches of his integrity way before he met Emma. There were treasure digging. He was in court, in and out of court for things. He was stealing liquor from, Mrs. Durfee's cabinet that she had to replace it with pepper sauce because she couldn't get him to stop getting drunk on the job. Like, he was stealing, he was lying, he was cheating people. He was very frontiersy, like, get ahead while you can. And I think that definitely applied to the women in his life. And, there's a story, I'm trying to remember the date, 1828, 1829-ish, where a neighbor of Emma Smith's parents say that one night Emma Smith appeared there distraught and said, I've made a terrible mistake. I don't know how to get out of it. Like, this guy is clearly not a good man. But a lot of people say that that's not a very credible report because it was said so many years after the fact. But I do think that tracks in a story of, like, we know that there were rumors that Joseph Smith was visiting brothels. We know that he was running. If Joseph Smith was pure and on the straight and narrow, look at any of his friends at the time. They were all running some serious game that didn't treat women well. So Fanny Alger, I think she was seen as an affair. Todd Compton, who I love and respect, and other scholars consider it his first plural marriage. Apologists will say that, wait a minute, the sealing keys, which are the seeds for the marriage sealing, are established in 1836. It's still a year after Fanny Alger. And what's interesting too is Oliver Cowdery, I believe that's where I'm getting the 1838 date. Oliver Cowdery in 1838, so 2 years after the sealing keys are first restored to Oliver Cowdery, he is writing and insinuating that Joseph Smith was having an affair with Fanny Alger. So we don't know what brought that on, but he's actually excommunicated for bringing it up 2 years after the sealing keys are restored to him.
Which all feels to someone like me like very retroactive and convenient, as he's kind of a very charismatic person that's thinking through, I have all these members, I translated the Book of Mormon, everybody's believing me about all of these different things. I know I have this desire to, and I'm seeing polygamy in the Bible, because in the Bible there's polygamy, or there's concubines, and the Lord gave them to those religious leaders. And I think that as this is all coming out, it just feels like he very retroactively is allowing himself to call someone like Fanny Alger his first plural wife, and the ones to come as basically giving himself permission to act on his desires to be with as many women as possible, and young women, while also being a religious leader.
What I've learned now working with outsiders and Mormons and of Mormonism and film crews is, like, these petty things that we discuss, like, which date did the sealing keys get restored? Only Mormons care about that. Like, to everyone else, it's such a clear-cut story of, like, grooming and a cult, But for us, because of what we're taught, we have to unpack the details. So I'm going to try to, hopefully, if I get too lost.
It's a good point, because it feels like the timeline, and that's why I'm prompted to ask, when were the keys restored? Anyone who watches this video who's not Mormon probably thinks, why does it matter? But to somebody who lived the teaching, lived the doctrine, and once believed that Joseph Smith was a very important prophet of God, that feels so vital. And even knowing, well, was Fanny Alger, most people would see Fanny Alger and say, obviously he groomed his live-in servant who was a very young girl, and he did that because he was a predator. That's how most people would spin that story. But for members, it feels like, to not refer to her as a plural marriage or a polygamist wife, that feels like blasphemy. So all the wording of polygamist wives, even that wording is a very, I'm sure to some of the people you talk to, is a bastardization of marriage, because marrying little girls and marrying women who are already married, calling that plural marriage is stealing the word marriage and making what is predatory behavior sound religious and good.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I wish that more Mormon scholars understood, because I think that there are things that are, and ideas that are so normalized, that aren't predatory, but are part of the scaffolding that uphold predators. I work with Tim Kosnoff a lot, who he is a lawyer who took the biggest case against the Boy Scouts of America for childhood sex abuse. He's taken on cases against the LDS Church. And he said to me on my podcast, he was like, the LDS Church is a haven. It's a paradise. It's Disneyland for predators. And I think about that all the time, and why that is. And I think, first of all, because the men that started Mormonism, we don't want to say this, it automatically, we lose capital with our faithful audience when we say this, but like, the men that started these doctrines acted like predators. They were predators. It was predatory. You will see it was grooming behavior. And so to make sense of that and to make them holy, we had to build all this architecture around it that incentivized men to become predatory. There's a reason why we're the true crime genre, like I said, and that exists still within the scope of what we're talking about. But you're right, outsiders, I wish they would also understand. They're like, I get a lot of, mad comments like, why are you calling it plural marriage? Call it what it is. It's sex abuse or whatever. I think it's fair, and I reserve the right to try to understand and unpack that architecture. I want to know why my grandmothers chose this. I want to know how it happened and why they got talked into it and what compelled them to do it. And the men, what they were saying to each other. That helps me unpack my own experience. Back in the day, they would have assumed that Louisa Beaman was the first plural wife. Now, Don Bradley, I believe, is contesting that, as well as some other people, because they've heard examples of other women, being considered the first plural wife. But I will say Louisa Beaman, there's enough evidence to suggest that the majority of the church body felt like she was the first plural wife. They come to Utah, they name like a fort after her, and erect this thing that was like first plural wife of Joseph Smith. So Louisa Beaman is a marriage that happens in Nauvoo. And so basically from Kirtland, after the Fanny Alger affair, to when they moved to Nauvoo, there's a lot of chaos. In between of that sandwich is the Missouri period, where the church is in a lot of conflict and a lot of war. And, they're getting an extermination order. Joseph Smith is being arrested. He's on the run. There's like so many things happening. In July of 1841, this is when we know Joseph Smith is actively teaching plural marriage, the doctrine of plural marriage, to members of the Quorum of the 12, including John Taylor, Heber Kimball, Brigham Young. And again, at this time, he's running around with some kind of shady characters. A man named John C. Bennett, who has sort of a dubious military background. He was considered a physician, a scientist. He helped popularize tomatoes and ketchup. He bred his own kind of chicken and hen, and he was a prolific, probably what we would term now as a sex addict. We know that he had relationships with women and probably men. He accused Joseph Smith of buggery, which is homosexuality. And so I think that there was a sort of, these guys were like partying hard, at the time. John C. Bennett is important because at first he gains power and influence with Joseph Smith quite quickly, and equally as quickly they have a falling out. And John C. Bennett, because he was so integrated in Joseph Smith's inner world, had a lot of tea, had a lot of dirt on Joseph Smith, and he decides to capitalize that and sort of make a career out of bringing down Joseph Smith. Now, the issue with John C. Bennett is I think he's a little untrustworthy just because he paints the portrait of the perfect innocent guy, Joseph Smith the villain, and John C. Bennett was right there with him doing a lot of bad stuff. So all of these guys start getting in on the secret, and that's when we see sort of an explosion of polygamy. So Joseph Smith in 1841 is married to Zina D. Huntington. And she is a woman who, there's about 11 women we know that Joseph Smith married that were married to other men at the time. Zina Huntington is one of them. And so these are called the polyandrous marriages. He marries women who are already married to men. Zina Huntington was married to, was newlywed to a man named Henry Jacobs. He seemed to be like obsessed with her, loved her for a long time. He went on a mission. It is believed that he probably knew about the marriage because he does stand into the proxy sealing. And we can talk about sealing development too. But basically, we know that he knew about it. He believed and trusted Joseph Smith. He was very ardently a believer of Joseph Smith. So he saw this as probably an honor or a sacrifice that he needed to make. It's when Joseph Smith is killed and she's sealed to Brigham Young. And starts to live openly as one of his wives, that the two sort of have a falling out. It's not sustainable and tenable for him. But different people would react in different ways. And so the Mormon apologist idea is that Joseph Smith was experimenting with the sealing practices. So sealing is a term where we believe, I hope I'm making sense, but like in the next life, there's going to be billions of spirits in heaven. How do we relate to one another? How do we find our people? How do we know who belongs to who? Joseph Smith is going to seal you together. So you're sort of bound together for eternity. So your tribe, your family, your group is going to be sealed together. So the idea is that Joseph Smith is marrying already married women to link them in dynastic sealing. So they're building a heavenly dynasty. Now, the problem with that idea is, first of all, he also was sealing himself to men at the time in a different capacity, not in a sexual or marital capacity. They were called law of adoption, where you could seal yourself as a son or a father to someone. So why didn't Joseph Smith just seal them as daughters or mothers to himself is a question. Also, we know that he married a mother-daughter pair and, sisters often. So you would think that one sealing to them would cover it, but the dynastic ties doesn't make a lot of sense to me. One of the polyandrous marriages that really gets to me is the sealing of him and Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde. So this is in 1841 as well. It's in the winter of 1841. Orson Hyde, her husband, is, in the leadership with Joseph Smith. He's a close friend of Joseph Smith's. Joseph Smith sends him on a mission to Israel, and he is there, and Jerusalem, I think, is the exact mission. So while he's there, something happens, and it's a big thing that's happening because it involves John C. Bennett. So we know that Joseph Smith and John C. Bennett were approaching women or something. Something was going on because by the time Orson Hyde comes home from his mission, John C. Bennett is accusing Joseph Smith of predating on all these women. Joseph Smith is accusing John C. Bennett of doing the same. And all of these public allegations start going back and forth. Of course, Joseph Smith famously slut-shamed Sarah Pratt, who was married to another Orson Pratt, saying that he walked in on her having an affair with John C. Bennett. John C. Bennett denies it. John C. Bennett says Joseph Smith is having an affair with Marinda Nancy Johnson Hyde, Orson Hyde's wife. And it's said that they explained to him it's not an affair. It is true. Joseph Smith has, married your wife while you were gone on a mission, but here's the doctrine. Orson Hyde doesn't respond well. He disappears for a while. He leaves a suicide note. He says he's a ruined man. He doesn't know who to believe, John C. Bennett or Joseph Smith. He feels very torn. His wife is there. He knows something that has happened. It's said that the Quorum of the 12, they finally find him. They take him days. It takes days to convince him. Brigham Young even said he thought that Orson Hyde had lost his mind. But eventually he comes around and they're all happy. And Orson Hyde eventually takes plural wives in the 1860s and all is well. They stay in the church. But that shows you the messiness of it, right? Like that there are married men that the story is, everyone was like Zina's husband. They were fine with it. They were not fine with it. I can imagine this reminds me of sort of primate behavior where, gorillas will kill and sexually humiliate, other males. To me, this is an example of Joseph Smith using power to sexually humiliate some of the men in his life to dominate them. Of course, there are other interpretations, but that's how I see it. We saw this in with David Koresh taking the wives of some of his closest friends, and it was a humiliating sort of alpha move. So I don't know, was it dynastic? Was it for the good of the ceiling? Was it because I don't know. I don't want to attempt to get in his mind, but from my perspective and the outcome, it did seem to be a hard thing for everyone involved.
Yeah, and I think back to what you were saying about how other people look at this and they're like, this is so cut and dry. Obviously, this was him stealing the wives of his best friends because he wanted to, and because he was a predator, and because he has this very obvious pattern that he's showing over years and years. But it does feel like there's so much apologist work that's done to convince active members that all of this was totally copacetic, totally God's will, and that anyone that you will find that's the rare person who was against it, that it was only because they just didn't have enough faith to accept the law of God. And I think that's why so many people are still in polygamy now, is if someone can be convinced to drink the Kool-Aid, then they're humans can be convinced of quite a bit, and humans can be convinced to stay in situations that are absolutely horrible if the predator, or if the cult leader, whoever it is, can just convince them of the fact that this is the best way. And I think that that's why a story like this is so terrifying, is not just that it happened, but that these people who initially have a very human reaction of, this is an absolutely horrible thing and I want to kill myself, can be drawn back in to say, and maybe he's thinking, hey, I gave up everything to serve a mission in Jerusalem for this man because I believe he's a prophet. If maybe he still is, maybe I am the one that's wrong in all of this. People can just get continuously looped back into what an outsider would say is obviously a bad situation.
I think that explains the sort of whirlwind that we're dealt with. And faithful historians have a real challenge here, because if you take the purity approach where everything Joseph Smith did was good and everything he instituted was good, he never made mistakes, or if he did, they were just like, maybe he cursed when he hit his hand with a hammer, but polygamy was fine. You're upholding the scaffolding of the architecture that still protects predators today. I don't care if that's a hard thing to say. It is the truth. We can draw direct lines from that. These ideas of making excuses for this kind of behavior, because, okay, let's say polygamy is on the up and up. God wants it for us. Then we're accepting that God is okay with Joseph Smith lying or marrying women behind his back, contradicting his own doctrines, which he will put pen into canonized doctrine later on about the processes for this kind of stuff. It's just indefensible. And if you do defend it, you're nailing some screwing some screws into the architecture that makes it worse for victims in current day Mormonism.
Before we continue with learning more about Joseph Smith's polygamy, I just want to share an amazing charity. It's called Holding Out Help. It is a modern day charity that focuses on helping anyone who is trying to escape modern day polygamy. It's not just specifically related to Mormonism, but they're definitely focused on a lot of the sects associated with Mormonism. They make contact with people, a lot of women and boys and men, really anyone who's looking to leave polygamy is able to go to this organization and get rent supplied for, food, really anything that they might need as they're leaving these communities. They often are completely cut out. They're left with just the clothes on their back, essentially. A lot of them have really major medical concerns because of the abuse they've suffered at the hands of these groups. So I'll put the link below. I am a monthly donor to Holding Out Help, and I definitely suggest checking them out as a charity and supporting their cause, because what they're doing is really crucial to helping people escape these really awful situations.
What I was going to say is we're in the 1840s, so it gets really messy. So we're talking about a time period that's really messy. A lot of stuff is going on. And so there's, I'm going to try to be as chronological as possible, but in this time that he's marrying these polyandrous wives, he also approaches his counselor, Heber Kimball. Heber Kimball would be a faithful, prominent leader in Mormonism for the rest of his life. And he was married to Valete Kimball, a woman that he loved. And we know that they loved each other because their early love notes at this time, when Heber would go on missions for the church, they would write hearts. They would draw a circle and say, "I kissed the spot for you." Like very sweet, tender love notes. Joseph Smith approaches them sometime in 1841, and he basically gives him what we call an Abrahamic test. So the idea is that Abraham of old, who is forced by an angel to choose between slaying his son Isaac for God, it's the same sort of sacrifice that God requires of men today. So Joseph Smith approaches Heber and says, "I want your wife Valete." Heber is troubled by this, Valete even more so. They're sick about it. They take a few days. They're in agony over this. It's probably similar to, I think it's an alpha move. It's showing whose power and loyalty how far you're really willing to go. Eventually, Heber and Valete say, "Okay, we've thought about it, Joseph Smith, and we hate it, but go for it." And Joseph Smith was like, "You're good. It was just a test, like you don't actually have to do it. But I'm interested in your daughter." Within the next few years, he takes their daughter, and we'll talk about that in just a minute in my timeline. But that he actually gives the same test to John Taylor and his wife as well. John Taylor was another counselor. And so we see him experimenting with the power and loyalty of the men around him. He also writes a letter to Nancy Rigdon, who is Sidney Rigdon's daughter. Now, Sidney Rigdon doesn't get enough credit for establishing Mormonism. When Joseph Smith met Sidney Rigdon, he had a ragtag following of people, not very many people. He had the Book of Mormon, which was getting some buzz, but it's really Sidney Rigdon who has the theological training and the expertise and the congregations that once he and Joseph Smith merge, Sidney Rigdon gives Joseph Smith the credibility. He becomes an actual church. They actually develop some good theology. Sidney Rigdon is debating some of the great religionists at the time in very public debates. He has a lot of credibility. So he really helps Joseph Smith. And so early Mormonism is as much his as it was the Smith family's. And so Joseph Smith starts to go after his daughter, Nancy Rigdon. He writes a letter to her known as the Happiness Letter. It has this argument where it tells, her why polygamy is of God and what God expects from her. And of course, when she shows it to her father, He is distraught. He can't believe this. And it ultimately leads to the destruction of their friendship, along with some other factors. So Nancy Rigdon, of course, is not having it. She is not happy about it. I think it's really interesting. She stands up to Joseph Smith as a young girl. Joseph Smith retaliates by spreading terrible rumors about her being a whore and a loose woman and dishonest. And he also does the same thing for the family. So he runs a pretty successful smear campaign when he is rejected by that. And it's around this time that, so now in the spring of 1842, he's experimenting with the endowment ceremony. And so he's taking the sealings in Kirtland and marrying them, for the pun, with this idea of a marriage performance. And maybe that there's going to be some sort of ritual that you do in the temple. It pairs with masonry. He was messing around with masonry at the time. So he decides, we're going to build our own temple. It's going to be different than Kirtland this time. And we're going to do a ceremony.
I've always wondered, because the Kirtland Temple, when I've been there when I was a very young kid, the Kirtland Temple is pretty much set up like a church, where there's pews, there's a place where the leadership stands, there's a place to give a speech, and it feels to me like a white it's not a temple, it's a white church building. It feels like this is what I understand to be a modern temple, basically, getting there, where there's endowment ceremony rooms, there's a baptismal font, and to me feels much more like it's reminiscent of what you would see now in a modern temple.
Yeah, you're right about that. The Kirtland Temple is completely different structure, different architecture. It's very Protestant. It's not, Mormonism hasn't really been introduced full scale into Masonry yet. Hiram Smith, some of them dabbled with it, but it really is in the Nauvoo period when they interact with the Masonic Lodge in the area. Joseph Smith, most scholars believe Joseph Smith was heavily influenced with the modern temple ceremony with Masonry and polygamy, because now at this point he has several plural wives that he has acquired, and his relationship with John C. Bennett is now really escalating to destruction in a very public way. That spring, John C. Bennett is excommunicated for adultery quite publicly. He writes an expose. John C. Bennett leaves and writes an expose accusing Joseph Smith of practicing spiritual wifery. And he even publishes a list redacting the names of Joseph Smith's current wives. So he's like sending a shot across the bow to Joseph Smith, saying, I'm going to name these women and I'm going to expose you. So Joseph Smith is, experimenting with a way to legitimize the practice. But again, it's still secret. Publicly, he is denying this. He's saying John C. Bennett is a liar. Whatever John C. Bennett alleged against Joseph Smith would kind of throw back at him, destroying his reputation, which would have been easy to do because John C. Bennett was kind of a seedy guy. So John C. Bennett has some of the women, including Martha Brotherton, who Brigham Young tries to approach to be a plural wife, who tells her story. So it causes a sensation, and it really starts the problems for Joseph Smith in a big way this time, because now it's a close associate who has seemingly some proof or some receipts of what's going on. At the same time, he still continues to acquire women into his fold. He is sealed to another one of his friend's daughters, Newell K. Whitney, his daughter, Sarah Ann Whitney. The Whitneys owned a store back in Kirtland. Basically, to me, I see this as another loyalty test of Newell K. Whitney to Joseph Smith. By the end of 1842, he's sealed to probably 12 or 13 women. We don't know because, again, historians can't decide. The amount of wives that we think that Joseph Smith had is anywhere from 25 to 49, basically. And it depends on what kind of documentation, how we prioritize the documentation. I like going with Todd Compton's number, Brian Hale's 32 or 33 wives. But at this point, by the end of 1842, he's got about a dozen wives. In the fall of 1842, Joseph Smith retaliates with John C. Bennett. He says, we're going to publish in our own newspaper, the Times and Seasons. We're going to say we are not polygamists. And it the rumors continue to plague him, partially because now it's getting out and several things are happening. Will Smith, Sam Brannon, and a couple other guys, Joseph T. Ball, who is said to be a mixed race man, possibly even a black man, run the branch in Boston. They're acquiring wives, doing the same sort of shenanigans. And word gets out, it causes a lot of problems, and Joseph Smith sends an apostle to go retrieve them, bring them back to Nauvoo to repent. So it's getting a little out of hand at this point. Joseph Smith continues to marry a bunch of other women. Some people start leaving the church, going to local newspapers, publishing things saying, the rumors are true, Joseph Smith is a polygamist. And this is when Joseph Smith approaches Heber C. Kimball for his daughter Helen Mar, and I think that's in 1843, in the spring of 1843. So he approaches Heber C. Kimball and says, thanks for passing the Abrahamic test. I want to marry your daughter, who is 14 years old. And Helen Mar is given the choice, and when I say given the choice, she's given like 24 hours to decide. She is miserable about it. If you read her accounts, they're heartrending. She says that, it made her miserable. She agrees to do it because it gives her parents salvation. They're agreed to get their endowment and their sealing in the temple. Now, Joseph Smith has decided by this point in 1843 that the incentive for women and men who will give this sacrifice of plural marriage is they get to go get sealed in the endowment ceremony, in a special ceremony that is going to seal them together to Joseph Smith forever. And being sealed to Joseph Smith at that time is essentially being sealed to God himself. So Helen Mar understands the importance of this to her parents. She says it explicitly. I knew that I was doing this to help my parents. I agreed to do it, but she was resentful of it. There's a lot of debate between scholars if Joseph Smith slept with his 14-year-old wife. And to me, that debate, I understand why people want to figure that out, because they want to figure out the character of Joseph Smith. Now, I've often said that we have to be careful with terms like pedophilia, because that's a very explicit term that means being attracted to prepubescent children. And we don't have evidence of Joseph Smith doing that. But we do have evidence of him being predatory and, marrying young girls who are barely pubescent. The question of whether he had sex with them or not, to me, is less interesting than what the actual sealing did. It controlled and dominated their lives in the same way. And I get frustrated when the conversation around polygamy is all about sex, because that is the male perspective of what happens. If you're one of 34 wives, you're not getting a lot of sex. That's not the majority of your life. The majority of your life is the great in-between, what I call it. Plural wives, it's very lonely. It's a lot of waiting around. It's a lot of being in your head about things. It's a lot of not being with your husband, but hearing about your husband. It's thinking about the other women. It's doing a lot of menial domestic tasks. And so, yes, there was sex involved, but even if Joseph Smith did or didn't sleep with 14-year-old Helen Mar Kimball, I think his reputation doesn't stand up to one of integrity. Sealing and trapping a 14-year-old so that she has no prospects, so that she's not allowed to interact, is a cruel and power move thing to do. Helen Mar complained about being sad that her friends got to go to dances and she had to stay home to protect her sort of her reputation and integrity secretly, and she couldn't even tell her friends. And I just think whether he slept with her or not, that doesn't take away the cruelty of what happened to her. She would go on to be a faithful member the rest of her life, but she struggled with deep, sometimes crippling depression. She was suicidal. She had, women like Eliza R. Snow would have to come and take care of her for a long time. She struggled. And I can't help but think it's, the feeling of knowing that you're giving away your entire prospects of romance as a 14-year-old girl to help your dad be with his buddy in heaven.
I think this whole conversation about, why aren't there children that came from Joseph Smith's marriages relationships, whatever we call them, or that proves that there was no sex, or even the fact that if there was no sex, that proves he was a good person. It really is a distraction, I think, from it's an apologist way to kind of distract from the reality of polygamy, especially since everyone after Joseph Smith was making babies with their polygamist wives. And there's, a lot of conversations about if some of them got pregnant at certain points or if he had sex with them. There's enough to suggest he probably did. Also, the doctrinal reason for multiplying and replenishing the earth is to have sex. It is to have children from these plural marriages. So I agree. I think that whether he had sex with them or not, I think most people would say he probably did. But if he didn't, it still isn't excusing him from the terror that this doctrine wrought on all these women's lives. Even just having, even suggesting to people, hey, I want your wife to marry me, just to prove that he can break up their relationship if he wanted to, really shows that whether it was about sex or power or both, it was really manipulative.
Yeah, and I don't want to discount the actual physical act, because I've spent time and talked with countless abuse survivors. I'm a survivor of sexual assault myself. Sometimes, that act itself can be transformative in a really negative way. But for the majority of people that I know, and I would say that the history backs this up as well, that act, if Joseph Smith slept with them, that was probably the least traumatic part of the experience. The experience was being owned and contained by a doctrine that harmed people. It was the reaction that they had to put up with. It was the scandal of it. It was the power dynamics around it. I imagine Helen Mar Kimball sleeping with Joseph or not. And again, it just feels so tedious that we have to argue this, because you're right. Like he didn't do an adoptive sealing with her. He did a marriage sealing. And the marriage sealing has some pretty specific instructions attached to it, right? That would suggest sex. But because this is a discussion in Mormonism, it's a meta discussion. I always like to tell people, it doesn't matter if he did the violence that he did to Helen Mar Kimball, knowing that her parents traded her for their salvation. Like, I don't think that we can understand what that does to a kid. It takes away, it violates them in a very specific way. And we see Warren Jeffs doing stuff like that within his modern FLDS, these sort of mind games that come along with this. Polygamy, I often say, is not about sex. It's about power. It's a system of power. And sex is just the weapon of choice that they use. But again, that's a male perspective. It's the man who's having all the sex. The women, it's a different life for them.
It's more, to me, becoming a trading card in a hand of cards. It's becoming a literal possession to be auctioned off or traded or, parlayed for power. Or I feel like a lot of times in the FLDS, it's like, if you trade me your daughter, you have a leadership position, or you get this preferential house, or it's not just about sex. It seems like it is truly about how to garner power and glory amongst this in-group, and using women as a way to get that power, because the trading card is what helps you pass through the door. And becoming a possession is, whether they're having sex or not, which they probably are, but whether they are or not, becoming a literal possession, like you're saying, to trade for salvation, to trade for a leadership position, is so dehumanizing. And it's a structure that you're going to take part in your whole life, whether sex lasts, for a certain amount of time or not. Becoming a possession of this cult leader, becoming a possession within, a marriage, that is a definitive role that you will occupy for the rest of your life.
And Joseph Smith is explicit about it during this time. They call them favors, trading favors being wives. They call them favors. I mean, they're very explicit about it. And, just as if you're walking down the street one night and you get jumped by a bunch of people and they assault you and they steal your stuff, your body will heal from that. But what is harder to heal from any sort of abuse is the domination, the power, the worthlessness that you feel from someone using you and taking something like that. And in a very concrete way, Joseph Smith's system does that to women daily. So whether they're being physically touched or not, they're still feeling the effects of that domination and that reductiveness to their worth and to their value. And like, what we're going to talk about, it's, you feel very replaceable. And that's not a small thing. And so I just get so annoyed. It's usually men that will argue back and forth, did he sleep with them or not? And it's like, that's one component of marriage, but it's not the only component. And I think that polygamy being reduced down to sex, or the predatory behavior being reduced down to sex without the power discussion is really a problem, because this is about power. Even in the doctrine, it's promising power to men. Women are the keys to men's salvation. Again, they're the mechanism. They are the interchangeable. You can make more keys. You can have lots of keys, but men get the salvation. And that's the part that I think still a lot of modern men do not understand what it feels like to be on the other end of that. The closest thing that they might feel is, just being a cog in the machine of God and never ever getting power themselves. I've got a few more that we can get through, and then we get through the end of his stuff if you want, because we're rounding the bases. We're almost there.
Okay, let's finish rounding.
Okay, so he at the same time Emma Smith becomes aware of this. She clearly, we knew she was aware of the rumors. I don't know, we don't have a lot of history to see how she dealt with it. Looking at the pattern of her life as she goes on to remarry similar men who, her second marriage after Joseph Smith died was a man who cheated on her, had a baby with another woman, and Emma raises the baby. So it seems to me that Emma Smith adapted and coped with just sort of stoicism, or believing that that's what was meant for women. I don't know. We don't have a lot of her feelings on it. But we do know from contemporary sources at the time, she was unhappy with the marriage ceremony. Or the idea that Joseph Smith was acquiring wives and turning it into doctrine. You have bodyguards that claim that they were outside the room when he presents a revelation to her saying, God has told me that this is happening, and she throws it in the fire. There are apocryphal stories of hearing them arguing. We know that she was tormented by it. And we know this because Joseph Smith had been marrying several of the women in the Nauvoo house that they had been living in together, he and Emma. A lot of the girls that he had hired to help Emma Smith out, he had secretly married behind her back, including the Partridge sisters. Emily Partridge was a young teenage girl who was in charge of taking care of Emma's baby. And Joseph Smith had secretly married her and her sister, and they were upset about it too, but they believed him to be a prophet. So when Emma is presented with the revelation, she's unhappy. Joseph Smith promises her this new sealing power if she'll acquiesce. She goes back and forth on it. She's very tormented, but she finally decides he can take on plural wives if she gets to pick. Now, he's married to dozens of, over a dozen women at this point. And she has no idea. And she doesn't know that some of them are her best friends in the Relief Society. She has no idea that all these women around her have already entered into this practice. They've all kept the secret from her. So she agrees to the marriage if she can choose the women, and she chooses the two Partridge sisters that live in her house, Emily and Eliza. And the Partridge sisters believe that they were chosen so Emma could keep an eye on them. Emma stands there for the sealing as they are remarried to Joseph Smith. Emma probably didn't know that, and never found out that they were already sealed to him, but they perform this sort of mock marriage for her where she is there. And then Emma is given her own sealing for time and all eternity in heaven. So she gets the crowning achievement, the endowment for her reward. Pretty quickly, within just a few weeks, it turns sour. She walks in on Joseph Smith with one of the girls. She forces him to cut it off between them. he comes in, I think it's Emily Partridge who says that he came in looking like really like sour faced and, said basically, hey guys, she says I have to stop, so we have to stop. And they said they didn't really see him after that because after that he's murdered. At this point, Joseph Smith has mounting problems, and not just the polygamy rumors, but definitely the polygamy rumors. But he's got a lot of friends that are turning on him. He's acquired too much power. He's getting very militarized in Nauvoo. He's running an army. They're running military drills. Now he's walking around in a full army uniform and carrying a saber.
This is also the time when he announces that he's going to run for president, I assume.
This is the time he is going to run for president. He's in charge of everything. He's over the government. He's over the school system. He's over the religious system. He's going to run for president. He sends out all of his apostles to go stump for him. He's very serious about it. And Joseph Smith at this time, I always like to say he's like the Britney Spears of Mormonism, because people in the country, in the larger America, were like fascinated. Even in Europe, he was an international scandal. People like were following this. They're like, this guy is crazy. There's this whole place in Illinois that's going rogue. People would sometimes go to visit just to catch a glimpse of him. He was like a crazy celebrity that people followed. He was very much a tabloid star. And so he's getting a lot of concern, including government concern. So it eventually leads to some of his former friends saying, we're not going to take it anymore. This guy's too corrupt. He's perverted Christianity. He's perverted everything. He's perverted our women. He's perverted our commerce. And so they publish what's called the Nauvoo Expositor, which is a newspaper that they set up to expose Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith, now being the mayor of Nauvoo and running the Nauvoo Legion, decides that this paper is a public nuisance, and Joseph Smith does something that is very questionably legal or not. He destroys the printing press. Now, if you're in America, especially in America after the Revolutionary War, with that in your recent memory, destroying information in the press does not go well. And so, of course, it leads to the ultimate death of Joseph Smith, where he is taken by a vigilante mob. The governor's involved, but kind of like, dude, you caused your own problems. And Joseph Smith is killed in Carthage in a gunfight. And basically, at this point, he has now married 34-ish women. Fanny Young, considering being probably the one that we know being the last, because we have a marriage date on her. But since then, there have been a lot of other women that have popped up that some people think are, were sealed to him. And after he dies, all of his wives are given the choice to be sealed to some of his counselors, including Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, or Amasa Lyman. And most people choose Brigham Young. Some choose Heber, poor ladies. And then I think one or two choose Amasa. So that's how it ends for Joseph Smith.
One thing I've reflected on a lot about my upbringing and learning about Joseph Smith is this idea that he died as a martyr, and that almost like the doctrine that I always believed he was killed because his doctrine was so pure and so almost hard to handle because of the Trinity, for example, all the three different members of the Godhead having their own separate entities and beings. All of these things that he taught were so revolutionary that people martyred him because of his doctrine, because of the restoration of the true gospel of Jesus Christ. And so then going back and relearning that he was thrown into jail because he burned down the printing press that was trying to expose him for polygamy and his other many misdeeds of the time, is just such a mind-blowing moment when I finally realized that, or learned it for myself.
Yeah, I think that's the conflict that we still have. And, there's this new resurgence of we're in the age of disinformation, right? And it's only going to get worse probably with developments in AI. And as we can't filter out what is true and what is fact. So conspiracy theories happen because people have just enough of the truth, but they have a desire that overrides their ability to look at evidence. And so we see that happening with a growing crowd of mostly LDS, with ties to a lot of fringe fundamentalist LDS groups that are polygamy deniers, that Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy. And it's a growing, concerning thing. And you can't reason with the people. They'll say, well, why won't you come on and argue with me? Because I've had discussions with them, and pretty quickly, within just a few minutes of the conversation, facts don't matter. I mean, I did a Mormon Stories episode, and then I think Michelle Stone, who is one of the biggest proponents of Joseph fought polygamy, did a 3-hour takedown of me, which was just 3 hours of character attacks on me, right? Because you can't come at these facts. The evidence is clear. And even for something as shady and secretive as polygamy, to try to protect Joseph Smith's character at the risk of the reputation of these women is very distasteful for me. But if you took polygamy off the table, Joseph Smith was still a criminal. He was still in and out of jail. They were plagued with charges of counterfeiting and stealing. And I mean, one of the best, we talk about this on the Sunstone History podcast quite a bit. He had this gang of people that would go and steal from the Gentile towns in Missouri. They disassembled a sawmill once just to take away their power. He's doing stuff that's illegal. We were raised by criminals and outlaws. Our people literally left Nauvoo because they were outside the law. They were outlaws. That's who we were raised by. We're trying to attribute all this honor among thieves because we need so badly for our life choices to be validated by that. We need so badly for there to be this purity story, because the purity story feels really good.
The martyrdom and the religious persecution is so heavily highlighted in Mormonism. And I learned, there's the scene in Legacy where they have Hans Mill, and it's the little boy cowering in Hans Mill. And you're never really taught to question why that all was happening. It feels like as you're growing up in this religious tradition, like it happened because they didn't like this religion because of religious persecution, that the reason Mormons were kicked out of so many different places was because of religious persecution. And it co-opts this narrative of religious persecution, which makes you feel like it must be true because all of these people were so up in arms about how pure our religion was. You never learn that there were legitimate reasons for the members to get kicked out of all these places. There was a reason why non-members, non-Mormons were up in arms about these people coming in droves and settling in these areas.
People, ex-Mormons will get mad at me and they'll say, why do you identify with Mormonism? What is worth keeping? Why do you still, I'm a member of record. Why do you still adhere to some stuff? I still pray sometimes. Logically, it doesn't make sense, but I love the ritual of it. I love sort of something that roots me to where I came from. The faith that I have in Mormonism still is in the humanness of it all. We are the most human because we're tested to the limits of integrity. What we were taught was integrity was not integrity. The stories that we were taught about telling the truth, finding the truth, was so warped beyond recognition because of this history, because the truth of what Joseph Smith was and who he was and why he was is not something anyone can ever get at. But the clues and the information that we do have suggest a very, very messy picture of a very flawed human criminal person. And to try to erase the truth of his crimes, his mistakes, his humanness does a deep violence, not only to history, but to our psyche. And it allows us to make excuses for bad behavior today. And I think that's why Mormonism is so unhealthy now. That's why it's no accident that the biggest concentration of Mormons that exists in Utah is one of the most unhealthy places for mental illness, sex abuse, sexual assault, eating disorders. There are reasons for that. And if the doctrine is so pure and beautiful and elevates people, I would think that a concentration of it would alleviate that, not compound it, but unfortunately compounds it. And so I think we take the wrong lessons from the history. Joseph Smith could be an interesting story worth mining some value from if we said, hey, here's a man that did all of these terrible things and convinced our ancestors to follow it, and like, why did they do that, and let's unpack how he was allowed to get away with so much hurt and violence. To me, there's some value in that, or people could find some value, but we go the opposite direction, and that's why I think we're so messed up. So yeah, I think that you deal with that with conspiracy theories. The biggest critique against me is my history isn't faith-based. I'm not rooted in enough faith. Guilty as charged. Do not have faith in that. And ex-Mormons will say I have too much affection, and that's probably true too. But again, for me, it's about integrating, in spite of all of the darkness and the abuse and the harshness and the cruelty of our religion, the poison of it, you still find people that are able to rise and find resilience and, make the right choices and stand up against, the bad ideas. And to me, that's something worth keeping. And that helps me alleviate some of the shame of where I came from.
I think I look back on my pioneer ancestry and the women I have several generations of polygamy, which I've learned more about as I've kind of been making these videos. And I think that to some extent, I do still find their tenacity inspiring. I feel like I guess I can take my heritage or leave it. But what I love about my heritage within Mormonism is the fact that I have ancestors who believed in something so thoroughly they would fight tooth and nail for it. They would cross the plains for it. They would risk everything for it. And ultimately, what they chose to believe in has been pretty definitively proven false.
And dangerous.
And damaging. But I do find their belief inspiring. And I hope to live a life that is so thoroughly full of tenacity and desire to act on what I believe to be true. And I think that that's why I'm so passionate about information and education, because I think that with those things, you can find beliefs and doctrines and life, lenses through which you can live your life that aren't so damaging. And you can find a new heritage, a new path to set yourself on that isn't so weighed down by what Mormonism actually was.
I feel a lot of compassion for people who are still in that belief system, in a very literal belief system. I have even more compassion for people who are trying to make excuses for Joseph Smith's behavior, because to me, those are people that really need him to be something. And I find that so interesting as to why. Like, if someone holds Joseph Smith so sacred, where's the irrationality around that? Why is his purity so important for you? And I think that that's the question that a lot of faithful people should ask, and really interrogate and be honest with the answer. And maybe they won't be, because I think, again, we're all irrational about our sacred beliefs. I'm sure I have some too, but I also am grateful for the experience of being able to be so wrong about something so big in my life, and I think that that's what a lot of ex-Mormons have, that the faithful won't understand until they experience it, is the beauty of being so wrong and like having that architecture crumble.
Yeah, if Mormonism teaches you to be a certain way, the beautiful thing about leaving it is you do feel like you're kind of sculpting from nothing. And that's how I felt when I left. And what's been, I think, the most empowering portion of my exit out of the church is just being able to go back and examine all the pieces of myself and really consciously choose what to keep and what to try to kind of root out, and really just feeling like you're starting from nothing. And that can be very scary and terrifying. And I think a lot of times I'll make a choice and then realize it was still motivated by my desire to either, get the church away from me as much as possible. And so I chose the exact opposite choice, not because I wanted it, but because I was just still having a strong reaction to trying to leave Mormonism behind as much as I could. Getting free of it almost feels impossible.
Yeah, and it's probably feels impossible because it is impossible. I mean, it shaped us, it's around us. And that's why, when I kind of laugh whenever I hear people be like, you can just leave Mormonism, you can walk away. You don't like, no, you can't. Like, that's not how brains work. That's not how our human development works. And that's okay. But I think that the goal for me now is, it's first of all, it's okay to be angry about what you went through and what happened to us. I will never stop being angry at what they've asked of our mothers and our grandmothers that raised us. Like, that, I've just accepted that that's not going away for me. I will always feel deep resentment. Maybe not. Life is long. But to that point, I also think that, there was a long time, many years, that when I changed my belief system and I started speaking out about it, I felt like I was a constant apology. I'm so sorry I left. I'm so sorry I'm a traitor. I'm so sorry I'm saying these things. I'm so sorry that I'm making you mad. I'm so sorry that I'm opening my mouth. But I remember Joanna Brooks said something to me once where she said, that feeling will go away eventually. Like, someday people will look at you the way that you look at them. And right now, when you just leave the church, you look at your family like, are they judging me? Are they judging me? And Joanna says, someday that's going to shift and they're going to look at you and say, is she judging me? Because I'm still Mormon. And I've seen that happen so many times. And I like to believe that the gift in our community, we all went through a very hard thing together. We come from years of violence and generational trauma. We are a traumatized people. We think in black and white because of that trauma. But folks like you, folks like me, we give those around us an opportunity of change. We're the thing that shifts the algorithm just a little bit, that forces them to confront something new. And for me, the only thing that helped me sort of learn and unlearn my Mormonism was being confronted with new things I'd never been confronted with before, so I could grow. So I see ex-Mormons, as messy and messed up as they are, and they are messed up. Every ex-Mormon needs to be in therapy, good therapy. We're also a gift to our people. Like, we get to give perspectives and challenges and opportunities for people to think different and to realize that there are other ways to think. And I think that that's a healthy thing. So that helps alleviate some of my anger sometimes when I think, okay, it's not my job to fix or rescue anyone from my community, but rather than walking around as an apology, I'm going to look at it as, I'm a growth opportunity for those around me, just like I was given growth opportunities that really helped me.
Yeah, I thought about how people get so upset about the stuff I post, which is usually just like you're sharing information, it's facts, it's dates, and the crazy thing about them getting upset is the stuff I say and the stuff you say has existed for decades. Anything I say at this point could be found in a Wikipedia article, but there's something so humanizing about a person who lived through it and is from the tradition coming out against it. And maybe not against it so much as saying, here's what needs to change. Here's what I went through. Here's my own personal story. And those things are much harder to ignore than an old document in a dusty library or a Wikipedia article. The face is what makes people so offended, because it's too humanizing. It's too hard to turn off. It's too hard to shut down. It's too engaging. It's too compelling. And I think that has been a part of my own joy and love of this content that I make, is that I edited myself and changed myself and quieted down for so long, and I'll only let anything come out of my mouth if I thought first, is everyone okay with this? Is this what a good Mormon would say? Is this what a good woman would say? And now the beauty is, I just love saying exactly how I feel, telling my story completely unedited, with reckless abandon for what anyone else might think of what I say, but finally just giving myself permission, which this was never permission that was granted to me. I took it for myself to just say, I will be saying exactly what I think, and I will not be apologizing unless I'm wrong. And then I will, but I'm not going to apologize because of how it makes you feel, because ultimately, for the first time in my life, I am centering my own voice in my own human experience. And that it's kind of crazy. It took me 30 years to get there, but here we are. And I think that's why, I've known about your work, Lindsay Hansen Park, for probably 8 years since I left. I've been listening to your podcasts, and people like you, your voice is what gives me permission to speak. It's what gives me the bravery to feel like I can do what you've done, what Fawn Brody did before us. Is these women who also have come out and said, I have something to say, actually. And I'm so grateful that you made the time to come on today. And I hope that other women and men, and I hope all people who come across this little tidbit of a video we made today can come across it and feel empowered to seek more information, to seek more education, to read the books that we've discussed, and to raise their own voices in ways that they feel are important.
Well, thank you for all of that. And I agree with you. I'll close by saying this. I wish I was the type of person that could have just been brave and courageous on my own and like figure out how to speak out on my own. But you're right. It took me watching other women that spoke out being like, wait, you can do that. You can talk like that. You can say that. You can claim that. I think that there's something really powerful in that. So, you're coming at their most sacred beliefs, and that's where you're going to find the most irrationality. And that's where a lot of rage lies in upholding the sacred. And I think that that's a question of interrogation for the offended, not for you to figure out what that means. Because if you're coming at their truth, their sacred truth, it's like no one gets upset about attacking gravity, right? We all understand that the law of gravity exists. So why be so mad about something you're so sure of? For me, it's claiming my Mormonism. That's my most radical act, I think, because it's who I am. I'm Mormon, bone and sinew. It's informed everything around me, and it probably always will in this lifetime, unless, I live in some simulation where I get to choose something less crazy. But that's who I am. And the story of you and the story of me and the story of so many of your listeners are legitimate Mormon stories. We want to think that if you leave the church, you don't get to claim your heritage or your pathway or your right to your experience. And I think that the ex-Mormon experience is such a prolific Mormon story that it's part of our history, and it's legitimate and it matters. And I don't care if faithful scholars don't think so. If they can follow and worship the hierarchy, I'm interested in more on what it does on the ground. And so, yeah, thank you for your work, because I'm sure that you're modeling that out there for women. And we grew up in a tradition that needs to have it modeled to give us permission. And so you're probably doing that for a lot of people that you don't even realize.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah, anytime you want to talk history, let me know.
Okay, sounds great. Well, have a great rest of your day, and thanks.